It is very dangerous to be America's enemy, but it is even more dangerous to be America's friend, has been confirmed once again,
Correct.
because effectively the Biden administration led the Ukrainians down the garden path. They made them promises that they were never willing to fulfill. Trump doesn't have this mentality. For Trump, the Ukraine war was a big strategic mistake. It cost a lot of money. It was never going to be won. It was always going to lead to yet another American defeat, like Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, now Ukraine. And it was a major distraction to what his number one priority, which is a war with China.
This is Yanis Varoufakis. He is one of the most outspoken economists in the world, the former finance minister of Greece, and a key figure in Europe's fight against austerity. Varoufakis is known for his outside-the-box thinking and common-sense solutions to the geopolitical struggles our world is currently facing. Professor Varoufakis is a founding member of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025 and the author of several books, including Techno-Feudalism, a groundbreaking book where he argues that the modern economy is increasingly controlled by a handful of tech giants, reshaping society in ways that resemble feudalism. In today's interview, Yanis and I dive into the European role in the negotiations surrounding the end of the war in Ukraine. As tensions rise, European leaders find themselves sidelined, with no clear voice in negotiations between the US and Russia. We'll discuss why Europe's lack of leadership is leading it to act as a vassal to the United States and how tariffs from Donald Trump could result in Europe shifting closer to China. Later in our interview, we focus on China specifically and discuss the latest breakthroughs in AI, which are changing the world faster than anyone could have imagined. Finally, we end our discussion debating the future of BRICS and the seismic shifts in the global order and trade alliances. Today's interview is one of the best geopolitical conversations I've ever had, but make sure you watch to the end as Professor Varoufakis delivers an incredible call to action for every citizen of the world. If you want the best geopolitical insights in 2025, this is the video for you. Let's begin. Well, everyone, I'm very honored to welcome into the studio Professor Yanis Varoufakis. Professor, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Professor, I want to start off discussing the status of Europe right now, because we have seen some very interesting developments in the past week. We've just had this Munich Security Conference. There are so many stories going on. Take us into your mind here on the status of this Russia-Ukraine war, and will Trump be able to end this effectively within the next few weeks or months or sometime in 2025?
Ukraine has lost the war. Putin has not won it, but Ukraine has lost the war. It is exhausted. Its people's morale is below zero. There are daily defections from the Ukrainian army. They fought magnificently, and all kudos to them for having stemmed the initial push by the Russian army. But now, 3 years later, they are done. It's clear that even Zelensky understands that. Biden knew that. Kissinger's dictum that it is very dangerous to be America's enemy, but it is even more dangerous to be America's friend, has been confirmed once again.
Correct.
Because effectively the Biden administration led the Ukrainians down the garden path. They made them promises that they were never willing to fulfill. They were never going to introduce them to let them into NATO.
Right.
It was simply in the interest of expanding U.S. hegemony. I remember a former chief of staff of NATO, an American general, many years ago, in 2011. I was asking him, why do we still have NATO? What's the point? He said,
Right.
There's no point for you Europeans, but we need it. And I said, Bob was his name, why do we need it? Or why do you need? And he said, for 3 reasons: to keep Russia out, to keep Germany down, and to keep ourselves in.
Wow.
So that's, and I think he was completely right. But, Trump doesn't have this mentality. For Trump, the Ukraine war was a big strategic mistake. It cost a lot of money. It was never going to be won. It was always going to lead to yet another American defeat, like Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, now Ukraine, and humiliation. And it was a major distraction to what his number one priority, which is a war with China. Cold War, hopefully, not a hot war, but
Correct.
He thinks that there is one game in town on the planet, and that is the containment of China. So what on earth are we doing? Wasting our resources and losing a lot of soft power worldwide with a war in Ukraine, which essentially is pushing Russia into the embrace of Beijing. Kissinger and Nixon did their utmost to keep those two forces apart.
Correct.
And now Biden has pushed Ukraine into the embrace of Beijing. This is how he thinks. Personally, I think he's completely wrong, and it's extremely dangerous. It's a clear and present danger for humanity to want to contain China. China is not an imperialist power. It's a regional power. It wants to control its region. There's no interest in building Chinese bases in Tijuana opposite San Diego, or patrolling the San Francisco, Los Angeles coastline. They just want to do business with everyone else. And to try to contain China in this way, risking a thermonuclear clash, is highly, highly toxic on the part of Trump. But I do hope that he concludes this pointless massacre in Ukraine quickly. And I think he's right to do it simply by talking to Putin, because the Europeans are non-existent. Who is he going to bring along from Europe? Von der Leyen. Nobody elected her. She has absolutely no legitimacy whatsoever. You know, a local town mayor here has more legitimacy than the president of the European Commission. France doesn't have government. Macron is a lame duck. The new government that will emerge from the federal elections in Germany this weekend will take months to come together. It will be a silly coalition again, just to keep the idea out. And even if they did have a government, the Lithuanians and the Poles would veto anything the Germans say and expect the Germans to pay for the outcome that the Germans will not have a say in. So if I were Trump, I also would leave the Europeans out, and I will try to come to the most important thing at the moment: freeze the conflict, ceasefire. If we can save a few thousand people from dying tomorrow morning, we have a moral duty to save them, because their death is utterly pointless.
For many decades, obviously, Europe has been very close to the United States because there's been a security guarantee, right? Obviously, the United States, after World War II, has always guaranteed Europe's security. It's been a great blessing to have the U.S. military as that security guarantee. Do you see that shifting in the near future? Where do you think, within the next 4 years, Donald Trump is going to completely, move away from that? I have read some articles, for example, saying that Europe needs to prepare for this, that Trump is just so vulnerable that we don't know what he's going to do. And do you see a shift away from that for Europe in the future?
When people say that they think Trump is very fickle and they have no idea what he's going to do, they have not been paying attention. Trump does what he has been telling us he will do for years now. Why are they being surprised? He said he's going to impose tariffs. He imposed tariffs. He said that NATO is pointless and that he is not going to be paying for European security. He's pulling the rug from under the Europeans. Why is he fickle? You may not believe your ears because you simply are in deep denial. But that's not Trump's fault. I don't want to support Trump here, but what I'm saying is that the guy is utterly reliable. He does what he claimed, and when he didn't, under Trump 1.0, do what he was planning to do, that's because Congress wouldn't let him and because he was not well prepared in his first term. But allow me to have a very different view of why Europe is so wedded to the so-called security umbrella of the United States. It's not because we need the American military to defend us from the Russians. Under the Soviet Union, maybe, let's not go that far back. But since 1991, Europe does not have any enemy that can actually invade Europe with any degree of credibility and military prowess. Putin has been trying to create this military capability, but you can see that even when he unleashed an all-out war against Ukraine, he's struggling to get a few villages in muddy plains in the Ukraine. And, thousands and thousands of Russians are being sacrificed for a few yards every week or so. There's no way that even if Putin wanted to invade Poland, even if he wanted to invade Germany, there is no way he could do it. And I think our leaders know that. So what is really behind this monomaniacal commitment to the Atlanticist umbrella? Well, if you are a German manufacturer of chemicals or of steel or aluminium, your viability depends on the United States because you're running, and Trump is right in this, you're running a large trade surplus with the United States. Essentially, the American trade deficit is like a vacuum cleaner that sucks into the United States your net exports. You get paid with IOUs called dollars because the United States is a deficit country. Any other country having the deficit of the United States would have gone bankrupt by now, except that the United States has the exorbitant privilege of the international reserve currency, the dollar. So they can print as many of them, of those as they want to maintain in perpetuity almost this trade deficit. But that trade deficit is the German capitalists' godsend. It is what keeps him in business.
Right.
So when, for instance, you remember a couple of years ago, Nordstream 1, which is this large underwater pipeline bringing cheap Russian gas into Germany, powering German industry. This was blown up. Now we know that it was the United States and Ukraine behind,
Correct.
with the help of Poland. They've more or less admitted. Okay. Now you are the German industrialist. They just blew up your supply of cheap gas. They are selling you at 10 times the price Texan liquefied natural gas, which takes ages to come, and you have to pay huge quantities of money in order to build terminals.
Right.
Whereas you had this pipeline that was bringing you, dirt cheap gas from Putin, right? So they blow this up, and you don't say a word, not a peep, no criticism whatsoever. Why? Because you rely on the United States trade deficit to keep selling stuff. That is the reason for the vassalage of Europe on the United States. It is the US trade deficit, which of course Trump wants to eliminate.
Right.
And when you are sitting in the boardroom of the large German corporations and you hear that Trump wants to eliminate the US trade deficit, you think, oh my God, let him fail, please.
Is the European Union, are they going to have to move closer to China to survive these new sanctions and tariffs from Donald Trump?
Let's step back from Donald Trump. Under Biden, a directive came from Washington to Brussels. Stop trading with the Chinese. Impose tariffs on electric vehicles from China. It's not that the tariffs imposed upon Chinese electric vehicles were the idea of the Europeans. They were not imposed in order to save the German car industry from Chinese competition. Indeed, it is Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, Stellantis, who are against the tariffs that Europe imposed on Chinese car imports.
Right.
Because they're doing a lot of business, especially Mercedes and BMW and Volkswagen. They're doing a lot of business in China. And the last thing they want is for the Chinese to reciprocate, to retaliate. So you have a Europe that's effectively a vassal of the United States under Biden. But in the context of the subjugation of the European Union to NATO and to the idea of the transatlantic alliance with the United States, European leaders, they held their nose and they imposed sanctions on Chinese imports. They started pressurizing their businesses to invest less in China in the context of the American plan to decouple from China, in the context of the American-led new Cold War against China, against the interests of Europe. So Europe was acting against the interests of Europe to decouple from China just in order to be America's effectively good boys and girls. And then Trump comes in and says, I'm going to treat you like enemies. What will the Europeans do in response? I don't know. Clearly, Europe's interest is to turn around to the Americans and say, okay, if we are your enemies and you're if you're going to treat us like dirt, forget, we are rescinding all these tariffs we imposed on the Chinese and all these restrictions on capital investments by European firms in China that we imposed simply because you told us to. Right. So, it's a new sheriff in town, fine. There are new rules in Europe as well. But that will take a smidgen of, how shall I put it, courage on behalf of the Europeans, which they have shown no evidence of so far.
Right.
So let's see. It is perfectly possible that, they will simply recoil and, bow their head to Trump and say, whatever you say, our glorious master. Right. Now, if they do that, then the already pre-existing dynamic of stagnation in Europe is simply going to be made worse.
Let's bring in China to the mix here, because the biggest story I think in 2025 so far certainly has been this invention, or the breakthrough of DeepSeek. I think DeepSeek AI has come through. It's obviously open source. It was developed for 90% less cost. I would like to ask you, how much do you think this open source DeepSeek and the Chinese breakthroughs threaten these tech monopolies and the oligarchs inside the United States, or the cloud capitalists, as you like to call them?
Well, let me just make the point as a preface that it was a bit of a Sputnik moment for the United States big tech sector, because just like in the 1950s, when it was the Americans who were completely and utterly convinced that they were decades ahead of the Soviet Union, suddenly the Soviet Union is in space before they are. So there is this similarity. Now, of course, that Sputnik moment made the United States go crazy in investing in the space age, and the result was that they not only caught up, but they surpassed the Soviet Union. I don't think this is going to happen now with big tech. But allow me to make the main point. The main point is this, and I think this is the main point of your question. Google, Meta, Amazon, they have nothing to fear. OpenAI is destroyed. And the reason for that is OpenAI has a business model which is really very old-fashioned capitalist model. They are selling a service, a product, a commodity in a market. So, they're asking you to pay $200 a month for the good quality ChatGPT.
Right.
And you buy that in the same way you buy a subscription to a cable channel, you buy gas to put in your car. It's a standard capitalist enterprise.
Right.
And here comes DeepSeek and offers the same product, even better, actually. I've been looking into it recently and, comparing and contrasting. Actually, DeepSeek is more impressive than ChatGPT,
Correct.
at least in my brief experience, for free. So essentially, that's it. The market of GPT has gone. But you mentioned my concept of what I considered a mutation of capital, a new form of capital, which I call cloud capital. It's the algorithm of Amazon, not just of Amazon, of Uber, or of Airbnb, of Google, and so on. But let's stick to Amazon as an example. It's going to be made much better with AI. It's going to be made more efficient. But even before AI came, if you had an Alexa, and this is the interface that you can buy very cheaply to connect you to all your appliances, and of course to Amazon.com. And it's an Amazon product. It's an interface which presents itself as your slave. You tell it, Alexa, switch off the lights, order some milk and honey for me from the supermarket, buy me a book,
right,
play me some music. So it sounds as if it is your slave, but it isn't, of course. What it does, it trains you to train it, to know you, to give you good advice, then to capture your attention through this good advice. And the advice is good. When Amazon recommends a book for me, I usually like it. Right. There's never been a case when it recommended a book for me that I didn't enjoy reading. Once, it captures your attention and gains your trust, then it has enormous power. It can actually say, it hears you talking to your wife or to your husband or to whatever, and it hears you talk about an electric bike, and then it comes up with a suggestion, maybe you should consider this electric bike. Previous proposals, suggestions were good. They will then the probability that you'll buy that bike is much higher. And that gives Jeff Bezos, who owns Alexa, who owns Amazon.com, an opportunity to do two magnificent things. Magnificent in the sense that they are historically pioneering things that had never happened before.
Correct.
It allows them to sell you the object of the desire it has implanted into your soul outside of any marketplace. You don't have to go to a shop. Amazon sends it to you.
Right.
And the second thing is that Bezos retains 40% of the price. That's a rent. He hasn't produced this thing.
Right.
This is a rent very, very similar to the ground rent that feudal lords used to extract from peasants, from ironsmiths, from artisans who lived and worked on their fiefdom. But Amazon has to be thought of not as a market, but as a fiefdom. That cloud capital, which creates Amazon, bestows upon its owner, Bezos, a remarkable capacity to extract rents from you, me, customers, and the producers of the electric bicycles.
Correct.
It's not capitalism anymore. It's not a marketplace. It's a digital fief, and it's not profit that accumulates wealth. It is rent. Well, that's feudalism. That's why I'm talking about techno-feudalism. And that kind of business model, that techno-feudal system, is enhanced by AI. And they don't have to worry about the Chinese because the Chinese have their own techno-feudal system. The equivalent of Amazon is Alibaba. And they have the same capacity to enclose within its digital cloud walls their own population.
Yeah, we've definitely seen the rise of China in that capacity. And do you think that there's any difference between these cloud capitalists in China versus America? Or are they more or less the same thing?
Well, individually, they are more or less the same thing. They're neither good people nor bad people with enormous power. You give exorbitant power to normal people, you get very abnormal people in the end. So there's no comparison. There's no difference there. But there is a fundamental difference in the political system. Because when the Chinese Amazon, Alibaba, reached a level of rent extraction, which was detrimental to the interests of the rest of the Chinese social economy, in the same way that it is happening in America and in Europe with Amazon, Uber, and so on. The Magnificent Seven, who are really extracting so much rent from everybody else. It's pathetic. Right. In China, the Chinese Communist Party grabbed the Jeff Bezos of China by the scruff of the neck and said, Jack Ma is his name, you overdid it. No. will give you the opportunity to enjoy huge riches, but not that much. So they put him in the sin bin for 8 months, and when he came back, he had his wings clipped, and the rent that Alibaba extracts from the rest of society has been thoroughly circumscribed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that we certainly see a different model. Obviously, the United States is very profit driven, and China is really going for more of the socialism, aspect, certainly embracing capitalistic forms. But there is certainly that goal from the Chinese Communist Party to, a rising tide raises all boats. So they certainly want to see more of all society, try to improve. At least that's that is the stated objective for them. And I think this transitions well into my next question, because we have seen China rise, providing this enrichment for the whole society, raising 800 million people out of poverty. And they have certainly done this outside of the Western form of democracy that we always hear about. And, China describes this as a dictatorship of the working class. Obviously, democracy is rooted in Greek conditions and a vocal point of your work. How has the Chinese success using this different system, outside of our Western views of democracy? Can you explain a little bit more about this and your thoughts about China's system and how it's risen and, its role in the world?
Cyrus, you'll allow me to not resist the temptation to say a few words about democracy. We all wax lyrical, and we Greeks, of course, are very flattered by that, about the continuity between ancient Athenian democracy and our democracies. There's no such continuity. This is an absolute myth. The ancient Athenian democracy was very flawed because women didn't vote. Metics, that is, migrants, didn't vote. I think Trump would have been happy with that. It was a small section of society of men who were citizens, but interestingly, the majority of them were poor. So in that sense, it was democratic and not aristocratic, that the poor were in the majority, and they could actually, for 30, 40 years, if that's how long it lasted. It didn't last much longer than that.
Right.
They had the opportunity to pass laws and make decisions that peeved the aristocrats, the wealthy, the oligarchs. So that was a genuine democratic experiment for 30, 40 years. But whereas our democracies, and I think the Republican Party is correct to say this is not a democracy, it's a republic.
Right.
Our democracies hark back not to ancient Athens, but to the Magna Carta. And what was the Magna Carta? It was nothing to do with democracy. It was a pact between the king and the barons. And the barons had enough of the king looting them. So they had a little war with the king. And then in the end, the king agreed to the Magna Carta, a concord, which said what? That the barons have the right to retain their slaves, their peasants, to do what they want with them. And the king wouldn't be able to steal the value produced by their peasants from the barons. Right. In other words, this was an oligarchy. What we have in the West today, not just in your country, but in my country, in every country in the West, under the auspices of constitutions that read beautifully. Your constitution is a work of poetry. There's no doubt about that. In reality, what we have is an oligarchy with periodic elections, which is not the same thing as a democracy. As a friend of mine, when I was very young, used to say, if democracy ever threatened to change anything, it would be banned. And we've seen that, how it was banned. I experienced that in 2015, when the people voted in the referendum in July 2015 in one particular way. The system made sure that very night, the people were overturned. Similarly, in the United States, if you read the Federalist papers, you discover that very objective of the American Constitution is to keep the hoi polloi out, to make sure that representative democracy impedes the demos from making decisions. So that's not that dissimilar to the view of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm a Democrat, so I'm not favoring the Chinese Communist Party over our system in the West. But what I'm saying is that we in the West, we have an overinflated view of how democratic our system is. It isn't. It was not meant to be. It was designed to be. It was just more clever than the Soviet or the Chinese system because it appears more. But in China, there is a very interesting experiment going on. If you go to the municipalities, recently I was in Shanghai, and I walked into the Shanghai municipality, which is a huge building. And there's a ground floor of many different assembly rooms. And there are boisterous debates happening in there because each room represents the citizens' assembly from some neighborhood. And they discuss the laws of their neighborhood.
Right.
you should see the manner in which they debated, they shouted at each other. There was a very dynamic democracy happening at the municipality level. Similarly, at the prefecture level, you have elections where the party's favorite son, usually son,
Right.
sometimes a daughter, is voted out, is booted out. So there is a very interesting democracy happening at the grassroots. There is no democracy at the national level. That's whatever Xi Jinping says. But even at that level, in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, which is a very large body, a bit like a Congress, you have clashing interests. You have members of the Central Committee that represent workers, other members that represent farmers, and you have representatives of big capitalists, producers of aluminium or cars or electric vehicles. And then you have big tech being represented there. And there is a big class war happening within the Central Committee of the Communist Party.
Correct.
But what they do have, which is absolutely extraordinarily helpful in terms of the developmental energy of China, is that they have a capacity to combine private ownership of the means of production, which is not socialist, it's totally capitalist, but with state-directed investment, that which the West is not good at. Because in the West, we have a lot of money which is not invested in productive capacities. So in the United States, you have the greatest accumulation of money in the history of the universe.
Correct.
Okay? But you still can't build a fast train between Washington and Boston. You cannot invest in the things that the things that Congress has set money aside to do. Like, for instance, things I would love if they were never constructed, like nuclear submarines.
Right.
But Congress wants nuclear submarines, pays for them, and you can't build them because the industrial foundation of the country has been atrophied as a result of the failure of the market system, which is a very oligopolistic market system and completely dominated by rentier capitalists who are not interested in producing stuff. They're simply interested in making a buck quickly from shuffling, pieces of paper, like, derivatives and so on. They are not converting the existing money into productive capacity.
Thank you for breaking down the Chinese government level, because I think that's what a lot of people actually don't understand in the West, right? We just think of it as one man ruling whatever Xi Jinping wants. But actually, when you do go down to the municipal level and to the local level, I think that's where a lot of actually democratic movements are happening. There's a lot of representation for the people and their voices. And, I've lived in China for over 10 years. And I think that's an interesting point that a lot of people need to understand, is that there is a lot of autonomy on the local level. Professor, I've got one more question I'd like to ask you. And I want to talk a little bit about, what we're looking at around the world. I want to talk about BRICS, de-dollarization, blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies. This is an interesting thing with Trump, because he has effectively said that the BRICS alliance is dead, right? We're going to put 100% tariffs if anybody shifts away from the US dollar. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the BRICS alliance and de-dollarization, and what are the trends of this going to be happening in 2025?
Well, the Chinese, who are the real power behind the BRICS, are creating the infrastructure for a new monetary system that replaces the monopoly of the dollar. They're not going to be stopped by Trump's threats of tariffs. The greatest ally of the hegemony of the US dollar at the moment is Beijing, because Beijing has not decided to press the button. BRICS Pay, which is based on a blockchain technology, and it's magnificent technologically and very, very interesting. It's an alternative to SWIFT, a way of making payments from one another. It's not, however, an alternative currency. Right. And it's not because the Chinese have not decided to go for it, because the Chinese have at least $4.5 billion US dollars in savings. So if let's say you had your money in a Swiss bank account, you would not want to undermine the Swiss banking system. It would be silly to do this.
Right.
So they've not decided to do that. As I said before, if you are an aluminium producer in Shenzhen and you're selling to California, why would you want to undermine the hegemony of the dollar? You live off dollars. But if the United States continue to pursue the new Cold War against China, especially the way that Biden turbocharged it with the CHIPS Act, effectively telling the Chinese, you are not going to become a technologically advanced society, which of course didn't work because they have so many good engineers that devised their own microchips. And then at some point, they will be absolutely determined, they already are determined, to have a monetary system which is ready for action. They need to have it, at an arm's length, at a push button length, so they can press it when they decide that enough is enough. But they have not decided to do this yet. They will make the system ready, but they will not energize it until they give up on the possibility of a decent agreement with Trump and with the West. So, Mr. Trump, stop hyperventilating and threatening the Chinese. They are your best friends at the moment. And if you push them too much, then the dollar is toast.
Appreciate your thoughts on that. One final question here, Professor. What, as we're looking forward in the future for 2025 in these geopoliticals, what is one thing that you want, kind of your message to the world? I mean, that you want people to really understand. I think there's a lot of confusion, whether in Europe or the United States, about the status of the world. What is your key message that you really want to put out there so that people can better understand the geopolitics around the world right now?
Look, Cyrus, if this was 1938 and it was the morning after Kristallnacht, the pogrom against the Jews in Germany, you and I and the rest of the world would have only one duty. That is to protect the Jewish people from the Nazi pogroms.
Correct.
Today, we all have, similarly, one duty: to end the genocide of the Palestinians. Because what started in Gaza does not stop in Gaza. This sheer brutality and the way in which they are, the powers that be, the Western powers that be, are effectively murdering international law, just completely rubbishing international law,
Correct.
Setting it aside. This is going to stigmatize our generation if we let this happen. That is my very simple message.
That's a brilliant message. I couldn't agree with you more. It's very hard for me as an American citizen to watch, the way that our government functions. And again, a very stark contrast to, how we want to call Putin a war criminal, try him, but yet, Netanyahu comes to the United States and is treated like a king. And even Donald Trump pulls the chair for him and makes sure that he's comfortable. I mean, it's incredible the amount of corruption with AIPAC and how they control Congress. And I love that message. It's the perfect way to end our conversation today. Where can we find your work? Where's the best way that we can connect? And I want our fans to really be able to continue following your work. And just thank you for the work that you're doing. Obviously spreading peace and a great message, and certainly appreciate everything you do.
You can find me on X at Yanis Varoufakis, or on the internet, yanisvaroufakis.eu.
Okay. Perfect. We're going to put the links down in the description for everybody below. Make sure you drop some comments here. Professor Varoufakis, thank you so much for your time, and we'll look forward to spending more time with you in the future as we discuss these global trends and everything.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, sir. Everyone, thank you as always for your incredible support. I'm really grateful to invite guests like Yanis Varoufakis on the channel to help us all understand the shifting dynamics in Europe and how it's navigating the complex negotiations over the Ukraine conflict and its relationship with the US and China. If you enjoyed today's discussion and made it to this point of the video, please make sure you subscribe to my geopolitics newsletter to stay up to date on the latest developments around the world. I'll drop the link down below. And finally, if you're interested in learning how Donald Trump's government shutdown in the United States is shifting global power to China, click here to watch our next video. Thank you all for your continued support, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.